Welcome back, I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series. It's a weekly series where we have our AI, DesignEye, look at a couple of my designs from previous years in competition and in practice and tell us very independently what the feedback is in terms of the principles and elements of design about those two designs, and then some suggestions for improvement along the way. I'll talk to you about how I constructed the design, what I was thinking about. If I in fact got physical judges' feedback, I'll tell you what that is as well, and we'll see where that path takes us. This week we're looking at layer by layer and Mardi Gras, two freestanding designs, so not on the bench, and I will talk individually about each of those. So let's get started with layer by layer. So this design, titled Layer by Layer, was from a world show in the very last days of global movement in 2020. So the competition was in late February 2020 in Jaipur in India, and so I had probably about 8 or 9 months to prepare for this design. I had to take everything with me, bar the fresh plant material which I ordered from there. That's the first time in a world show that I've done that. In previous years I've always taken everything with me, and you'll see other designs throughout the series where I have done that. This time around, because of the intricacies, I shall say, of import and export, I thought it was better, more prudent, faster to order the flowers to be picked up there. It's always a risk, it's always a gamble to do that in an international competition, because you don't know the quality of what you're going to get. And in a lot of the time where this is such a big competition, they're more attuned to providing for the floristry industry, so they're not as concerned about imperfect flowers. And I know there was a very terrible incident in 2014 at a world show where a particular country had ordered flowers thinking they would come from the European suppliers, which they did, but they weren't perfect. They in fact weren't usable in terms of a competition, because you lose points when your plant material is not perfect or you get downgraded. They weren't game to use it in this sort of a prestigious competition. So, and there was no alternative. You get there on the day, you've got 6 hours to stage your designs, and you've got no way of getting other plant material. There was also an incident in Barbados in 2017 where a hurricane, or a pending hurricane, meant that none of the flower deliveries arrived on the island until about an hour before the end of staging. So great consternation amongst the people who had ordered that way. This time around, as I said, I thought that it was more prudent for me to order the plant material. I wasn't going to use a whole lot of plant material. I did take some with me. So let me now talk about this particular design. The stand itself was supplied. It is an upright stand, as you can see, and it's got 4 sections of mesh on it that are horizontally placed in different sizes. And so that obviously provided us with the layers, or the layering of the design basis that we would use. And so here I've incorporated some stringing of material from the layers, from those mesh bases, as well as from the curved arms that I took with me to provide some tension and some movement in the design. And I've repeated that circular or curving arm with some of the Xanadu, not Xantheria, the Xanadu leaves, and knowing that the anthuriums would also provide a little bit of a curl if I needed to, and give me some variety in terms of colour and shape and form. So that was the basis. The rest of the design, the pink part of it and some of the bony colour part of it, is actually jute sliver. And I used that particularly because this is a particular material that is used widespread throughout Indian-based floral art, and I thought that was paying some respect to the hosts that I was there, that I would use a material that they're used to seeing and used to using in my designs as well. The design itself didn't place in the competition, and at a world show level I'm not as concerned. It's awesome when you do get something, and I did win something in Barbados, the time before this particular show. But I knew that I was up against some very, very high-class competitors worldwide, and in fact the ones that won were the ones that I would have expected to win. When I look at the design now, I think that there's not enough obvious layering. Yes, there's layers, but it's not... The designs that were in the prize-winning groups had very much clearer layers, and there was not as much gap between the layers as I have in my design. I'm happy with it. It came out pretty much the way I wanted it to, but I can see some things that I would have done differently, or I should have done differently, when I look at it now, sort of 4 years later. So let's now see what DesignEye has got to tell us about this design. Start with line, as we always do. The design uses both curved and straight lines effectively. The curved lines of the plant materials and the structured straight lines of the supporting strings create a dynamic interplay, which is good, but it's not, in terms of line, that's where the layering should have been really, really obvious, and it's not in this assessment. So shape. The organic shapes dominate the design, especially with the leaves and floral elements. The layered structure creates a series of horizontal and vertical planes that guide the eye through the design. And that it's interesting that it felt that there was vertical planes as well, because when we think of a layered design, we think of it in terms of being horizontal. So that would be something that I might explore, given that I like to do things a little bit differently and out on the edge. I might think about the layering vertically rather than necessarily horizontally. Looking at form, this is a three-dimensional design with depth and volume, emphasised by the layered arrangement and the protruding floral elements. The overall form is sculptural, resembling a modern art piece, which is very nice. It's a nice assessment to have, and once again, it has seen that it is layered, but yes, it's a layered arrangement, but in terms of the title, it's layer by layer, and I don't think I've interpreted that well enough for the judges. So we look at texture. The texture is varied, with the roughness of the fibrous materials contrasting with the smoothness of the leaves and flowers. The juxtaposition of these textures adds tactile interest, and I'm very pleased with that, because I was concerned about having enough of a contrast between the textures and making it obvious, and I think that choice of the anthuriums and the Xanadu leaves meant that they were both very smooth surfaces, and everything else had the rougher texture of the jute saliva. The colour palette includes muted natural tones with pops of white and light pink. The soft colours create a calming effect, and the dark green leaves provide contrast. There's probably not a lot else you could do in terms of layering with colour. Perhaps I could have had gradings or shades or tones of a colour rather than just the single colours, so the pink and the cream, the white and the green. Another thing to think about in terms of interpreting that title is having layering of colour as well as layering of material. In looking at space, the design utilises space well, with significant negative space around and within the structure. This spacing prevents the design from feeling crowded and allows each element to stand out. Now, obviously, when DesignEye is looking at an image, it doesn't know necessarily the dimensions of the design and how it had to be, what sort of space it had to fill out. That was a concern for me, because I was worried about keeping it very flat against the mesh layers that were provided, given that we didn't really have a whole lot of other depth space to use. So one of the reasons that it looks like it's maintained in that space is because that was the space that we had to use. The balance, the design achieves asymmetrical balance. The visual weight is unevenly distributed, but balanced by the positioning of the floral elements and layers. I'm a bit disappointed with that. I would like it to have symmetrical. I had hoped that it would have symmetrical balance, in that the two curved arms I felt were going to balance either side of the design. And yes, the mesh layers are different sizes, and so there's not the symmetry in that you would expect, but the placements should have enhanced the symmetry of the overall design. So that's something I need to think about. Contrast is present in the textures, the rough fibres versus the smooth leaves and flowers, and the colours, dark greens and browns versus light pink and white. this contrast adds visual interest. So it's interesting that in terms of its independent analysis, it sees that there's contrast in the colours, whereas I was more interested in seeing whether I should have looked at that colouring being layered, as I said earlier. The emphasis appears to be on the central layer with light pink flowers which draw the viewer's eye due to their colour and placement. And that's probably wasn't on purpose. As I said, I would have liked the design to be somewhat more symmetrical than it has appeared. Yes, you are drawn to that middle section because it's the biggest, and because so obviously the pink stands out more. Perhaps if I'd done it the other way around and had the more natural coloured sliver on that larger arm, it would have helped the design. So swapped around those alternating layers, but I do have the pink on the curved arms as well, and so that's going to make them stand out more, which was a conscious decision. I wanted them to be obvious in the design to break away from that very structured horizontal layering. Rhythm is created through the repetition of shapes and colours in each layer. The design is a flowing movement that guides the viewer's eye from top to bottom. Yes, the rhythm is there. I still think that the anthuriums they're a bit jarring in terms of rhythm. I think they just stand, particularly the white ones, just stand out a little bit too much. I needed to enhance the curve of their stems to incorporate it more into the rhythm of the design and to moving through the design with your eye. The design elements are well coordinated with the colour scheme and material choices, creating a harmonious look. The repeating elements in each layer add to the unity. So that's good, that it's unified. Once again, I just think that the white anthuriums are a bit too bold, a bit too dominant in the overall design. The proportions of the elements are balanced, with larger leaves and flowers placed strategically to create a harmonious and proportional composition. That's a good reflection of how I wanted the design to be. Yes, I was careful about my plant choice so that the size proportions would be right in terms of the overall design. And once again, I just keep going back to those white anthuriums because I just keep seeing them in the image, that I just think that I could have done more with them to keep them in proportion, but have them more rhythmically and unified in the design itself. By incorporating the following suggestions, the layer-by-layer design can achieve greater visual impact, depth and cohesion, enhancing its layered approach while maintaining its dynamic and engaging qualities. So this is what I want: cohesion, and I want probably a little bit more depth within the design. So let's see what it's suggesting we do. Increase the colour variety. Introducing a few more colours, such as soft purples or yellows, could add more depth and interest to the design. These colours could be subtle to maintain the calming effect. Probably the purples. I'd probably go for the purples, not the yellows. And once again, I could have it so that it was layered. The colour change was layered to enhance that layer-by-layer interpretation. Refine the layer edges. The edges of each layer could be refined to appear more cohesive. Adding small uniform elements like twine along the edges could enhance the definition of each layer. And that's probably true if I wanted them to emphasise that negative space between the layers. I think what I lose in this interpretation is the real layered effect. It just looks like there are levels rather than layers within the design, if that makes sense to you. Highlight the vertical elements. The vertical elements could be highlighted more to enhance the structure's height and depth. This could be achieved by adding light-coloured strings or adding additional vertical floral elements. That's something that I really have to play with and practice, because my brain says layer by layer is a horizontal interpretation. So having it as a vertical interpretation within this framework, and certainly could use it within this framework, and it would have been a very different interpretation to the others that were there, because the mesh is going to provide you with the structure to do vertical layering across the design. I guess the trap with that would be maintaining the depth of the design. It would be even flatter than this one is in its horizontal interpretation. So there we have DesignEye's interpretation of this design. Lots of things for me to think about. I agree with some, I don't agree with others. I'd have to really think about how the interpretation or the suggestions that it has made would work for me in terms of my design style and my design comfort levels. But that's a part of this education journey, and that's why having this feedback is so good for me, because often at these competitions I don't get verbal feedback. I certainly very rarely these days get written feedback from a competition, and I need that feedback to help me on my journey, because everyone can learn and should still be on an educational journey in terms of their floral art time. So let's now look at our second design. That was called Mardi Gras. It is staged on a wire mesh screen. As you can see, we had 1 metre square to use, so we could go outside of the wire mesh a little bit, but I chose to maintain most of my design within the mesh itself. It is judged both sides, and so that's why you've got to see the two images here. When we have a design that is judged in more than one direction, so both sides or front and sides or all around, you need to ensure that the design looks good from every angle. It doesn't have to be the same, doesn't have to be a mirror image in this case, but it needs to be interesting from both sides, and it needs to be a single design. So it has to look like it's one design, not a design on either side of the screen in this case. So here I've used some hat stands, some wire hat stands, and they're covered with stockings or tights to give them that reedy colour and to take away from the metallic look. And I've put a couple of straw hats, and each of the straw hats is decorated a little bit differently in terms of fruit and vegetables and plant material, and keeping it bright and engaging, like a hat that you would wear in a Mardi Gras parade was how I looked at it. And so the connecting piece between the two, once again in my stringing phase, so I'm doing some experimentation with one of the curved rods that I use for the stringing in designs, and I've pushed it through the wire so that it is visible from both sides of the design with a multicoloured jute string on it for the stringing, so keeping within the plant-based material. And that, my idea with that was to have it as like a flag that might be carried in terms of a Mardi Gras parade. So that was my interpretation and my construction. The design placed second, and I did actually get a little bit of feedback from the judge at the time, and she would like to have seen another of the curved elements in the design just to reflect that idea of something being carried both sides of the screen and both sides of the parade. She understood that it was about being in the parade and wearing the hats and having the colourful flags. She just would like to have seen one more interpretation of a flag. And whilst I appreciate that was her viewpoint, to me that would have made it too reflective, too structured a design, where too much a mirror image design, which I mentioned earlier. I would like there to be interesting elements on both sides rather than almost the same thing on both sides. But so that's where we differed in our viewpoint. But let's now see what DesignEye's got to say and if there's some improvements I could make. Starting with line once again, the design utilises both straight and curved lines. The straight lines of the leaves and the curved lines of the woven elements create a sense of movement and flow. So that's not just the flag replacement, but also the straw hats, because they're round and the colour is repeated through them, so we get that sense of movement through the design. The shape, organic and geometric shapes are present. The organic shapes of the floral elements contrast with the geometric pattern of the woven materials, adding visual interest. So choosing those hats, now both the hats came from charity stores and I wanted them to be bright, but I could only find one that had the brighter natural material woven into the hat itself, and so the other one was plain. I had to add plant material to brighten it up and to give it some visual interest. This is a three-dimensional design with depth created by the overlapping elements and the use of space. The form is dynamic and playful, fitting the Mardi Gras theme. Now, I'm very pleased with that interpretation because it is quite difficult on these screens to get something that has depth, and the hats help me do that, but it's the actual placement of the hat stands at that angle and making sure that they're secured to the screen so that the screen is not the thing that you get drawn back to each time. The screen is just where you see these elements, but you are drawn to the colour and to the form of the element. The texture is varied, with the roughness of the woven materials contrasting with the smooth surfaces of the leaves and the fruits. The textural contrast enhances the tactile quality of the design. So that's probably something that in looking at it now, I would like to see improved. I would like to see that certainly there is that contrast of textures, but I think that the rough texture of the hats is far more dominant than the smoother texture, and so I'd like to see a little bit more smoothness introduced into the design, and perhaps the other flag would have done that had I done a similar shape by weaving one of the palm leaves into the nautilus style of thing that we do, that and put some colour through that, so had some flax or some other colours through that shape. It would have given me the same shape as the flag replacement that's there, but it would have been a smoother texture, and so once again there would have been that contrast between the two textures of those two very similar elements. Whereas if you look at the hats and the hat stands, the textures of those are the same. So there's no contrast in terms of the hat texture is the same both ways, and the fruit and plant placement on top of the hats is the same. So it's the smooth and the hats are the rough. Colour. The colour palette is vibrant and bold, featuring bright greens, reds, yellows and purples. These colours are lively and festive, suitable for a Mardi Gras theme. And that's very much how I wanted the design to look. I wanted to keep it nice and bright. As I said about the hat, I would like to have had more colour in the other hat, but I couldn't think how I could do that with plant material that would keep fresh for the period of time that it needed to for the competition. The design uses space effectively, with elements placed at different depths. The negative space around the design prevents it from feeling cluttered, and it allows each component to stand out. And that's very much when you're using a screen, and that's often the case when you first start to use a screen. This is a staging, I have to say this is a staging that I love. I love doing things on the freestanding screens because it gives me the opportunity to move about in that space and to really feel like the design is alive, whereas if I put it on a bench, it feels a little bit static to me, and that's just my interpretation. Lots of people love using the bench and having their designs on display. I like doing these things on the screens. So the space, using the space, what I learned after my first few attempts at these kind of designs many, many years ago now, was to place things on an angle on the screen rather than have the screen determine the framework for your design. It was to place things on an angle. It lessens the impact of the screen and it gives you more room to move and to incorporate that negative space as well as the space that you're using across the screen itself. So balance. The design achieves asymmetrical balance. While the elements are not identical on both sides, they are arranged in a way that creates visual stability. Interesting that visual stability is part of the balance of a design, even though it's asymmetrical. And it is asymmetrical because the sizes of what is placed on either side are different, and it's not a mirror image, so it can't be symmetrical in that sense. And it does have that single flower, and the single flag. And as I mentioned earlier, my concern in putting another one there would be that it starts to give you the idea of symmetry rather than asymmetrical balance. There's a strong contrast in textures, smooth leaves versus rough woven materials, and colours, bright primary colours versus neutral background. This contrast adds vibrancy and interest to the design. So yes, I think we've covered the idea of the contrast and my concern about the contrast in textures, that I would like that to have been a little bit more obvious, but I'm happy with the contrast in the colours. The emphasis is on the central cluster of fruits and leaves. The bright colours and central placement draw the viewer's eye to this focal point. Now that's probably reflective of the fact that I only submitted one image to DesignEye for it to assess, so I didn't look at both sides of the design. But if you look at the images of both sides of the design, that's true for both sides of the design, so that's good. The rhythm is created through the repetition of colours and shapes. The curved lines guide the eye through the design, creating a sense of movement, which is good. And I like the idea that there is rhythm. Now, when I just think of rhythm on its own, I think that the suggestion about having the extra curved piece is right, because I think it needs a little bit more rhythm on one side of the design. But once again, you can't just look at one element or principle of design and think, well, I'll focus on that, I'll fix that. Everything is interlinked. So in looking at the rhythm, there is still rhythm there, and we've got rhythm in terms of the repetition of the colours. So it's the shape that I would have to be careful about repeating in terms of it maintaining the emphasis and maintaining contrast and maintaining unity. So unity now. The design elements are cohesive with a consistent use of colour and materials. The theme of Mardi Gras ties all the elements together, creating unity. So this is a case where the presentation of the design has actually interpreted the class title well enough that it is obvious. And that's what you want out of a design. You want a judge to look at your design and know what the title should be. So in this case, the judge did look at this design. She did understand that it was about being in a Mardi Gras parade, or being in a parade that was celebrating Mardi Gras. And so I'm pleased that that was not only obvious to the judge that was there on the day, but also to DesignEye in looking at the images, or the image. The proportions of the elements are balanced, with larger leaves and fruits anchoring the design while smaller elements add detail. And this is one of the challenges of this kind of a design, is that you want it to have impact, particularly with this kind of a title. I wanted it to have impact, and if you know anything about Mardi Gras parades, you know that they're always over the top size-wise, and so keeping it in proportion in terms of the decoration and making sure that if I was using smaller elements that they were repeated, so that the proportion, not so much massed but by repetition, kept it in proportion to the rest of the design. Let's now look at some suggestions that can give this design greater visual impact and cohesion, enhancing its festive and vibrant qualities while maintaining the dynamic and playful nature of the theme. Enhance the depth. So adding more layers or elements at varying depths can enhance the sense of depth and make the design more dynamic. And that's very true. I think I've talked a lot about depth in these designs when they're on the screen, and there's other videos where I've done designs where I struggled with the depth, getting depth in a design where it was actually a design that was only on one side of the screen, but I really struggled with getting some depth on that design. And so this one I think has got reasonable depth because I've angled those hat stands out so that it gives me the width of the design as well as the depth of the design. Increase the colour variety. Introducing additional colours that complement the existing palette can add more depth and visual interest. For example, metallic accents could enhance the festive feel. So that's a very good suggestion, and yes, I would like to have seen a lot more colour in it. I think that I started to get fixated on having the fruits incorporated as well as the flowers, and I forgot to really bring in some nice bright coloured flowers, so bird of paradise, strelitzia, or something in the more tropical range, so heliconias. Anything in the tropical range would have added both colour and vibrancy to the design and give it just a more enhanced festive feel. So refine the edges. Once again, same as the earlier design, the edges of the design could be refined to appear more cohesive. This could involve adding some small uniform elements to create a defined boundary. So maybe, once again, in terms of the flag replacements, the curved lines, if I'd had the two and if I'd had them more towards the edges of the design. That would have given some refined edging to the design. It's very true that there isn't a defined edge to the design other than the edges of the hats, and so that would be something that I would play around with and see what worked for me in terms of this design. So there we have our two designs for this week, layer by layer and Mardi Gras. As always, I encourage you to submit your images of your designs and get some feedback from our DesignEye AI interpretation. As I have mentioned previously as well, when you submit an image, it is looked at with DesignEye. You'll get the results back in 24 hours or so, but a human judge actually looks at it as well to make sure that the interpretation that's coming from DesignEye is worded in a way that is easy for you to understand and easy for you to look at your design and work it out. If you have difficulty, we have all of our team on hand to help you, and all you need to do is email back and say, look, I don't understand what this means, and we're more than happy to give you our feeling of what that means so that you can improve your designs. This is all about you and your floral art journey, and I hope that you take advantage of this opportunity to have your designs analysed and to get some really valuable feedback. You can see how valuable it is, even for me, after all of these years of looking at designs and doing designs. I still need that help. I still need something independent to look at a design and tell me some suggestions of what I could think about. It's not about it's right or it's wrong. It's about think about this, try this, do this, and how lucky are we in this day and age to be able to have access to that kind of help for our floral art journey. I will leave my soapbox talking there and talk to you next time you visit one of our designs. For now, I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series.